Hello, I'm Helena. I am very nervous, mostly because I had a beautiful, very, try hard PowerPoint made. And then last night I saw that I had accidentally deleted it because I am a boomer. And so this morning I've been kind of frantically remaking it. I hope that even though it's not the most put together looking thing that anybody's ever witnessed in their life, I hope it still helps everybody follow along, because what I'm going to be talking about today is a little bit esoteric, in that most people kind of don't really understand that this is going on and don't understand how this is impacting young people to identify as trans or want to transition. So I think this will be really helpful to hear about for any clinicians or researchers or therapists who are out there working with these young people, because this definitely impacted my experience. And just from being in online trans communities, I know that this has impacted many, many, many other, especially young girls. So without any further ado, let's see if I can figure out how to share my screen again. And here we go. So, yep, as you can see, what I'm going to be talking about today is fandom and how it relates to gender identity. So what on earth is fandom? Hold on, let me move this little thing out of the way so I can read what I wrote here. Fandoms are basically communities, primarily online, although fandoms have existed before the internet. But now, when you say fandom, people mostly think online communities, devoted to discussing, celebrating, and creating content inspired by books, TV shows, movies, musical artists, or celebrities. Before I kind of get into the rest of this stuff here, I will tell you a little bit about my experience in fandom. So I spent the majority of my teenage years in these communities. And it, for most people, for myself and also for most young people, it's not a casual thing. It's not like, you're kind of here and there looking at this stuff online. Most people who are participating in fandom, it's a huge part of your life. You're spending a huge amount of your waking hours perusing this kind of content and talking to other young people about your interests online. And I got into it when I was about 14. It started for me a little bit differently than maybe some others. It actually started with classic rock, which was a pretty small fandom, although there are some very big and popular fandoms, notorious fandoms. But that's kind of where I started out. It was just, I was this 14-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old, eighth grader, really obsessed with Elvis and the Beatles. And I didn't know anybody else who was my age, and not like a 50-year-old who was into these interests in the same way that I was. And so I was constantly looking online for new kinds of content. And I stumbled on a website called Tumblr. Tumblr has long been known for like one of the biggest hubs for fandom communities. And that's where I saw other people were posting about my interests. And I saw that, most importantly, it was other teenage girls. So that really drew me in. I started posting immediately. I made an account. Other young girls started following me back, and I just like really took to it. And fandom was a huge, huge, huge part of my life up until I was about 18. So that is my story with it. After classic rock, I moved on to Harry Potter, which is a much bigger fandom. That's kind of why it's like ironic that J.K. Rowling is such a big TERF now, because, well, I say TERF in a loving way, not in a negative way, because it was her book that really kind of like influenced me when I was not really her books, but it was the fandom around her books that really influenced me when I was developing my trans identity. So it's a little bit ironic. That's not her fault. So then after Harry Potter, it was various musical artists. I, was in the One Direction fandom for a while. I was in the Justin Bieber fandom. There's a huge fandom for like BBC shows. So like Sherlock, and what are the other ones? I don't remember, but I know that a lot of people like Sherlock, Supernatural's another really big fandom. So there's all these like notorious fandoms. Anyway, so what are the key aspects of fandom culture? Because fandom culture is really kind of, it's known as being its own thing. It's kind of a very notorious thing online among young people. So this would be a constant stream of new art, fan fiction posts. People are really creating stuff. It's kind of a creative hub. It's where creative young people go to basically just create things. And it's usually kind of centered around this one strong interest they have in their life. Shipping, which is something that I will delve into a lot more later, which is basically, you know, the short version of it is relationships between characters or celebrities that people are very interested in. There's this thing called headcanons. A headcanon is basically, you know, interpreting a character or a aspect of a piece of media however you like. So I might have a headcanon that Harry Potter is black or something like that, which he's not in the book, but in my headcanon he is. So it's like this personal interpretation, and it's a very major part of fandom culture. There are many sub-communities and sub-interests within a fandom. So you'll have different ships, communities, you'll have all sorts of just smaller enclaves within the larger umbrella where people can get together, and oftentimes it creates like an echo chamber effect where people are just very, very focused on a small, narrow group of things. There's this unrestrained creativity that I was kind of talking about before, where there's really no checks and balances. There's no kind of like social stigma against maybe going too far with certain ideas. It's just a lot of people really bonding over this kind of creativity and pushing the limits. And that creates some of the wilder aspects of fandom culture that do make it so notorious. And then lastly, it's usually a pretty obsessive thing. Like I said, it's not something where people are just kind of casually engaging with it. It's usually like these young people where they're very, very, very focused on a interest or a sub interest that they have, and they're just thinking about it all the time, talking about it all the time, and it's never really satiated. It's just constantly kind of there. More things that make online fandom so unique and infamous, because it is very different than maybe other fandom communities in the past, like before the internet. So there are aspects of it that make it distinct from any other kind of fan culture in the past. One aspect of that is that people are always plugged in to the point where it's kind of an alternate reality. It's like you have your world in the real world where you're, you know, talking to your family or going to school or whatever, but then you have this kind of alternate reality that you can access via your devices where, you know, it's totally different people, it's totally different content, and you kind of always have access to that. There's no real break from it like there would be if you were only participating in real life fan communities like people did in the past. There's just infinite content, and it's always novel, and it's always at your fingertips. So again, there's no real stopgap, there's no taking a break. It's just like the more you search, the more you find, and the more you try to push a limit, the more you find that other people are pushing those limits and creating that kind of novel content. There's also that echo chamber effect and that insulation that I was talking about earlier, where really people are whittling down their social experience to only people who are very similar in personality and very, very similar in that they share these incredibly niche interests. And as to my next point, it's not like there's only 2 or 3 other people like that, like there might be in real life. If you found a group of 2 or 3 other very similar people, you have access to thousands of other people, hundreds or even thousands of other people all across the globe who are so similar to you, which is a very it's a very unique thing to kind of these internet communities. And there's also the aspect of really unrestrained fantasy and co-fantasy, where people are just spending an enormous part of their days engaging in fantasy and having relationships that are very centered around fantasy and sharing fantasy with each other. So it's not very grounded. And when people are spending a huge part of their lives in these communities, things can kind of get a little bit out of control because there's just so much fantasy. So who is the most drawn to fandoms? The largest demographic would be adolescent girls, although there's also a decent proportion of maybe young adult women, so like early 20s, although it's much smaller than the adolescent girls. And then there's a very small percentage of like fully adult women. And then there's also a very, very small number of males of any age. It's really like it's an extremely, extremely female dominated aspect of the internet. And as for the kind of personality traits, there are certain personality traits that are very drawn to fandom as well. So it's not really like any teenage girl gets involved in fandom. It's mostly teenage girls who are very emotionally intense, creative, obsessive, introverted, and intelligent. So these are really girls who they don't want to have casual kind of relationships where you just talk about like what's going on at school or what's for homework. They want to have these intense relationships where you can really get into these interests that they have. And they want to just kind of be like following this fantasy dynamic and really engaging with this stuff and creating new ideas. So that's the kind of young girl who is very drawn to fandom. And it's a very just homogenous kind of atmosphere in terms of the people who are in it. So when we talk about fandoms and fan communities and what people are interested in, it's not just kind of general. There's usually specific aspects of whatever media or artist or celebrity that the fandom is concentrating on that are explored more than other aspects. And some of those aspects, I think number one is usually relationships. That's a huge aspect of fandom culture, is exploring relationships, either real relationships that are actually written into the book or TV show or in the celebrity's life, or exploring relationships that are fictional in that the fans themselves are making it up. Another really big aspect is the emotional lives of the characters or celebrities. And that can be real things that you actually do see written in the book or talked about by the celebrity, or it can be kind of theorized. And that's, again, where a lot of fantasy comes into play. People do take it pretty far with theorizing and assuming things about or creating stories to themselves about what the emotional lives of these characters and celebrities are. So there's a lot of emphasis on that. Characters and celebrities that fans find physically attractive, that's a huge aspect too. There's that attraction aspect, just that like fangirling aspect of just really liking a certain boy or male or anything like that. And it is almost always a male. Fandoms are usually centered on kind of obsessing over a male figure. The significance of a certain piece of media, character, or celebrity to a fan's emotional life is also very important. So like, you know, with musical artists, you'll see fans who are like, oh, this X artist's music saved my life. There'll be those kinds of narratives. Or maybe about a book, you'll be like, you'll say that this character just really, you relate to them so much, and it just, you know, helps you hold on when you're struggling. And then lastly, relating to or identifying with characters or celebrities. And this is often done by projection, kind of like how I described that the emotional lives, real or theorized, are very important to fans. This kind of comes into play with relating to a certain character or celebrity, where fans will kind of make up a story that might be somewhat grounded in reality, but really it's kind of the fans putting their own spin of things onto the emotional experience of a certain person, and then relating to that projection onto that person. So there's this mix of fantasy and reality and emotion that goes on. So I mentioned this word earlier, shipping, and this is by far one of the most notorious aspects of fandom culture. It can get pretty crazy out there, but shipping is, so a ship is short for a relationship. And then the verb version of ship is shipping. And when you ship something, that means that you like the idea of that being a relationship. So if I ship person A and person B, I like the idea of person A and person B being in a relationship together. I find that concept very interesting and captivating. The most popular ships and the vast majority of ships are male ships. And we're going to go into maybe why that is, some of my thoughts on why that is, because it is undeniable that the greatest focus is on the male ships. And this is mostly, again, adolescent and young adult women who are heterosexual being obsessed with these male pairings. Yeah, it's basically, it's an infatuation with the fantasy of two people being in a romantic or sexual relationship. And it really is an infatuation. It's not just a casual thing of, oh, I think person A and person B would make a cute couple. It's really focusing on it. It's creating art of these two people together. It's writing fan fiction, oftentimes also erotica of these two people together, and it's a huge focus. It's just like an absolute infatuation with this idea of this relationship. I think it all kind of boils down to it being a way to explore romantic and sexual themes and dynamics while maintaining a certain distance from it. This is usually really appealing to people who are intimidated by romance and sexuality in the real world, but they're also really craving that kind of intimacy, and they're craving relationships. So they end up turning to this kind of shipping phenomenon, because they're unable to meet those needs and satisfy those cravings in the real world. It's appealing to young girls and women who are very, very intensely attracted to boys or men, but they don't seek out relationships with male peers. And this might be because they're very shy. This might be because they have been hurt by males in the past, maybe abused or assaulted. So for whatever reason, they don't have these relationships with male peers. They're oftentimes very behind their other peers in terms of having those age-appropriate relationships. So you might have a girl who's 18, but has never even talked to like a boy ever, or has never been on a date, or who has never like held a boy's hand. That was definitely me. I was that girl who just avoided real male peers at all costs, but at the same time, I was just intensely preoccupied with the idea of boys. So that's one of the things that is so appealing about it. It's also appealing to young girls who like I said, they don't have social experience with boys, or they're otherwise struggling to adjust to adolescence in general. Adolescence is kind of a time period where everything is changing in terms of the social dynamics. So maybe before puberty, when everyone's a kid, boys and girls might be able to be friends, and it's all just kind of neutral. It's all the same. There's not this undertone of like, oh, who's dating, who's romantically attracted, who has a crush. There's not all that. But then adolescence happens, and some of these young girls are just very unprepared for that, and they have a really hard time adjusting to that, and they're intimidated really by this unfamiliar territory of male and female relationship dynamics. And Lastly, oftentimes one will identify with or project onto one person in that ship. And I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more here in a second. So you might be thinking, what the hell? Why is a heterosexual girl obsessed with gay male ships? Wouldn't she be more interested in male-female relationships because she's a female? She should be projecting herself onto a female in a relationship with a male. What's going on here? So I have a theory about this. And this is kind of taken from my own experiences, but it's also just taken from looking back on all that time I did spend in fandoms and talking to so many other young girls who are very similar to me in that perspective. So I have a little bit of a pathway that I'm theorizing, where a young girl becomes infatuated with a male character or celebrity, and maybe even has a fantasy relationship with him in her head, and then feels intense resentment and even hatred at the canonical or real life romantic interest, female romantic interest of this male. And this you will see reflected in fandom communities. They're absolutely known to just freaking hate the female love interests of their favorite male celebrities or characters, to the point where, like, when it comes to real life people, the female love interests of certain male celebrities have just absolutely been put through the freaking ringer by their female fans. One like super notorious example is Taylor Swift when she was dating Harry Styles. They just like totally like went after her. These girls may feel insecure comparing themselves to this female love interest of their favorite male interest. They may look at, like, for example, you think of like a teenage girl, she's having a hard time adjusting, she's having a hard time socially, she's insecure, and then her favorite male celebrity is dating this gorgeous, beautiful bombshell celebrity woman. That creates just a lot of insecurity, and they really want that. They're having this fantasy relationship with this guy, and then they have this competition with this female, and it just creates so much insecurity. And like I said earlier, they may just be having a hard time adjusting to the complexity of maturing male-female relationship dynamics, where the idea of a male-female relationship gives them more anxiety than excitement or anything like that, where they don't want to be reading about male and female relationships because that's just really stressful. Going from there, some may start reading fan fiction about their favorite male celebrities or characters, and they may start out with reader fan fiction or ex-reader fan fiction, which is a second person fan fiction, and it's aimed at being immersive to the reader. So it'll be like whoever celebrity kisses you on the lips or something like that. But it's known for not being very good. Like, it's just kind of poor quality. So if you have a young girl who is really drawn to fan fiction and wants to be reading about that kind of stuff, you know, it's usually just not that good. And somewhere along that line, they'll stumble onto the gay pairings, the male-male pairings. And these are usually third person, and they're usually much more well-written. Like, when I tell you guys, there are epic, like 70 chapter works of like masterwork arts made about these gay ships online. I'm telling you guys, it's crazy. So they're usually a lot more well-written, and it can provide a vector for the girl to explore relationships and sexuality with the male objects of her infatuation without confronting all that resentment and insecurity and hatred and self-doubt that is triggered by female love interests and male-female relationships. And I promise I'm getting to a point in how this all connects to gender identity soon, but I need to give you guys this kind of background. Yeah, and then to touch on like the erotic aspect of it, erotic or romantic erotic scenarios that don't include women, because women cause all of those aforementioned negative feelings of insecurity, especially in like an erotic context. If the young girl in question is very insecure about her body, like thinking about a situation with her, male celebrity interest in an erotic situation with a very attractive woman, like that is just painful to these young girls. And instead, when it's two men, it can be just very seductive because they love men and they don't want to see the women. And it's just kind of like this weird, perfect storm for them. So what does this all have to do with gender and gender identity? So to begin, I will just say that in fandom communities, the absolute vast majority of adolescent girls are identifying as some form of trans. So there is a strong correlation. It's very popular. And part of this has to do with the shipping, the headcanons, the fantasy, and the other part has to do with the fact that fandom communities are very strongly into this kind of social justice worldview. It's super, super prominent. So any fandom community, it's going to have that hierarchy of, if you are a cis het white person, you're evil, you're terrible, you're horrible, you're disgusting, you're an oppressor, you are just the worst thing that has ever been put on earth. And then on the other side, if you're trans, if you're gay, if you're not white, then you are amazing and everybody needs to be super nice to you and all that kind of stuff. So there's just that kind of situation in these fandom communities. And the LGBT spectrum is really elevated in these fandom communities. And part of that is because of that love of the male-male pairings, where these girls are just really obsessed with the very idea of gay men, and they almost think it's like they're being like pro LGBT by sharing this like gay fan fiction. It's a little bit convoluted, but that's definitely there. And then in terms of the shipping, these young girls, they're really experiencing their relationship fantasies as being between two boys. And they're developing an aversion to male-female relationships. And kind of in this environment, especially with that kind of social justice hierarchy that says that being trans and being a gay boy is so much better than being a boring old oppressive cisgender straight girl, they can really start to overly identify with the gay ships and that kind of dynamic. And it can be in this environment where there's no checks and balances on the fantasy, and it's just all these young girls identifying as trans together, shipping these ships together, talking about this all together. It's just so easy to kind of have your identity lines so blurred and to start to overly identify with being a quote gay trans boy. And then the headcanons also like really come into play here, because you can have a character and then you can maybe relate to that male character, but you are molding that character to be how you want him to be. And oftentimes there will be kind of a blurring of the lines between what is that fan's personal identity about themselves and what is their headcanon of their favorite character. So it's just like, again, another just blurred line when there's no reality, when there's no grounding, when it's so separated from any kind of judgment, and you're just always in this kind of like fandom community. Again, the lines get really, really blurred. So that's kind of, if you take away anything from this presentation, just think about these are young girls who are engaging in so much fantasy. It's really geared towards loving boys, celebrating boys. Social justice tells them that being a cis straight girl is a terrible, disgusting thing. They feel insecure about being girls. They think being a boy would be so much better. Being a boy is so much more exciting. They don't have to confront all of those insecurities that they have about relationships between men and women. And it's just so easy for the fantasy to take over. A few more little notes about fantasy. Again, it's 24/7. There's no checks and balances. When you're in the real world and maybe you're role playing with your friends on the playground and one of you plays the role of Superman, you can pretend to be Superman all you want, but you'll never be able to fly. Whereas in these online communities, it's almost as if you can fly because you're not doing the role playing in the real world. You're doing it online. There's so much fantasy. You're lost connection with the real world peers and your physical body. So it's just, it becomes very real. These favorite characters and these celebrities can start to feel like a real part of you. You see yourself in them and you want to emulate them very badly. So imagine an adolescent girl who is obsessed with an attractive male character, simultaneously is feeling affection for him and exploring relationship ideas through him as a vector with other men, and also wants to emulate him. And then gender ideology comes along and says, this is all a sign that you're trans. This is all a sign that deep down you really want to be a boy. And I'll give you all an example of what that kind of looks like. So this is a Tumblr post and it has 72,000 plus notes, which is like impressions, that's likes and retweets. And it says something that bears mentioning. I get why we need to shame straight girls who fetishize MLM, that means male loving male ships. But to any straight girls who consistently relate to or resonate with male loving male dynamics on a deep level or see themselves in queer male characters, if by any chance this post from a tiny, tiny blog crosses your dashboard, please take this moment to very privately consider the possibility that you might not be straight or a girl. And this is so freaking pervasive. This is everywhere. And by the possibility that you might not be straight, that's not saying that she could be a lesbian. That's saying that she could be a gay boy. So that's pretty much all I have for you guys. Some stuff to think about. If you have a client or a child who is very into fandom, this is kind of like what they're experiencing. And this post that I have right in front of you, that's just one really good example that I felt like kind of ticked all the boxes for what I'm trying to explain to you guys. But this is not the only post. It's a culture. It's an entire culture of, you know, being obsessed with boys in this very unique way, and then being told that that makes you trans. So yeah, that is all I have for you guys. I hope you enjoyed and I hope you learned something, and I hope this didn't just go completely over your heads.
That was amazing, Helena. Really, really amazing. I'd say everybody has so many questions, we don't really know where to start.
Yeah, everybody probably is like, what the fuck?
I might just ask you just a couple of questions and then we'll roll into the panel discussion. Is your kind of thesis that this is kind of a female sexuality that is kind of falling all over the place effectively online?
Yeah, I think this is like, I wouldn't say it's a female sexuality, because now that I'm like, I used to be very into this like gay shipping stuff when I was a teenager. And now that I'm older and like more comfortable with my body and in a real relationship, like I'm not interested in that whatsoever. It was very much something when I was younger. So I don't think it's like asexuality, but
A
but
developing sexual expression or a
I
developing
think
sexual curiosity or something.
I think it's like it stems from things that are developmentally normal for certain adolescent girls with certain personality styles and maybe certain life experiences. Yeah, but it just kind of, because there's no restraints and there's just so much fantasy involved and it's so disconnected from the real world, it just kind of spins out of control. But I think at its core, it is like developmentally normal.
And it reminds me, like, it just reminds me, I don't know whether this sounds ridiculous, but like I think of, you know, Frank Sinatra's Bobby Socks or whatever they were, and the Beatles and all those girls screaming at all those concerts, and they had lost it. And in the 70s, those girls, and they were just literally insane. And I remember hearing about girls kissing posters all the time, and it feels incredibly similar.
It
But
is similar.
yeah,
I definitely think that's kind of it's definitely a phenomenon that has been present. I'm sure, I mean, in like Roman times, there were women who were doing this about gladiators. Like I think it's kind of it's a normal aspect of female sexuality and like romantic interest. But I think it goes like beyond normal when there's just no kind of like connection to the real world, when you're just spending so much time online and not really having real relationships.
yeah, yeah. And a lot of girls, I think they start off with like being obsessed with, somebody from a pop band, and then they move on in an ideal world into that.
Yeah,
Nice to see DeTrans Awareness Day is trending on Twitter. Great.
nice.
Yay! Can we take a moment? That's great news. But I do think that the big difference is there isn't doctors ready to medicalize that in any other generation. And this is the big,
Absolutely,
huge,
absolutely.
massive difference.
And that's really what I'm trying to convey. Like, I literally guarantee you that if you took a pool of all the adolescent girls who are, trying to transition right now, and you look through their social media, you would see, God, especially out of the heterosexual ones or even the bisexual ones, you would see a vast majority who are in fandom culture and they're engaging in this like shipping stuff. But it's like the clinicians, they don't realize that. They don't know about this. And so you're really like, you're medicalizing something that is so kind of like you're making something permanent and physical and real, which is in essence a very kind of like fantasy, like developmental adolescent kind of fantasy, like romantic exploration.
Wow. Wow.
And that's definitely what happened to me.